The porcelain clinked against itself with a delicate precision that only comes from generations of breeding, each note ringing across the mahogany table like a death knell disguised as refinement. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore adjusted her black silk gloves with practiced ease, her pale fingers steady as they lifted the silver serving spoon, and, in that moment, watching the crimson preserve slide across the bone china, you might have mistaken the scene for any other autumn afternoon in 1864 London. The wallpaper, imported at great expense from Paris, depicted pastoral scenes of shepherdesses and lambs, their innocent faces watching over the proceedings with painted eyes that seemed to follow the movements of the 5 women gathered around the mahogany table. Outside, the fog pressed against the tall windows like grasping fingers, and somewhere in the distance the church bells of St. Bartholomew's struck 3 o'clock with the weight of centuries, their bronze voices carrying across a city that had grown fat on empire and blood. Have you ever noticed how the most civilized settings can become the backdrop for humanity's darkest impulses? How the very trappings of respectability, the fine china, the pressed linens, the careful pronunciation of vowels, can serve as a mask for something far more primitive lurking beneath the surface. Mrs. Whitmore's parlor, with its Turkish carpets and crystal chandeliers, had hosted countless afternoons just like this one, gatherings where the wives of bankers and barristers would sip their Earl Grey and discuss the weather, the servants, the shocking state of the poor. But today was different, though the ritual remained precisely the same. The careful pouring of tea into cups so thin they were nearly translucent, the measured spreading of preserves across delicate triangles of bread, the gentle murmur of conversation that never rose above a whisper. The difference lay not in the ceremony but in the nature of what they were consuming, though none of the women would have used such crude language to describe their afternoon refreshment. The ladies themselves were pillars of Victorian society, their names appearing regularly in the society pages of the Times, their charitable works the subject of admiring commentary in drawing rooms across Mayfair and Belgravia. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore, the hostess, was the widow of a colonial administrator who had made his fortune in the sugar trade, though the source of that sweetness was rarely discussed in polite company. Her late husband, Colonel James Whitmore, had served with distinction in Jamaica and Barbados, where his methods of maintaining order among the plantation workers had earned him both wealth and a reputation that followed him back to London like a shadow he could never quite escape. The Colonel's death 3 years earlier from a tropical fever had left Evangeline with a substantial inheritance, a grand house in Belgravia, and memories that sometimes woke her in the night with visions of things she had witnessed but never spoken of during their years in the Caribbean. The wealth that allowed her to maintain her position in society had been built on foundations she preferred not to examine too closely, yet the knowledge of those foundations had perhaps prepared her, in ways she was only beginning to understand, for the moral compromises that would eventually bring her to this afternoon's gathering. Her guest, Lady Margaret Thornfield, wore mourning dress that had never quite been set aside since her son's death at Balaclava, the black crepe of her sleeves rustling like raven's wings with each movement of her arm. The Battle of Balaclava had claimed Captain William Thornfield, along with hundreds of other young men whose names were carved in marble monuments across England, their sacrifice glorified in poetry and song, even as their mothers learned to navigate a world that no longer held space for their particular grief. Lady Thornfield's husband, Sir Reginald, had died shortly after receiving news of their son's death, his heart simply stopping one morning, as if it could no longer bear the weight of loss, leaving Margaret alone in a house filled with portraits of men who would never again sit for dinner, or laugh at her stories, or kiss her forehead before retiring for the evening. The loneliness had been consuming her slowly, day by day, until she had found herself willing to consider remedies that her former self would have dismissed as the desperate fantasies of the mad or the grieving. The Honorable Mrs. Victoria Ashworth sat rigidly upright, her spine never touching the back of her chair, her reputation for moral rectitude so firmly established that even the most vicious gossips found nothing to whisper about her conduct. She was the daughter of an Anglican bishop whose sermons had thundered from pulpits across the country, condemning vice in all its forms, while building a fortune through careful investments in enterprises he never examined too closely. Victoria had inherited both his moral certainty and his talent for selective blindness, qualities that had served her well during her marriage to Charles Ashworth, a member of Parliament whose public advocacy for social reform was matched by private business dealings that would have scandalized his constituents if they had ever been fully exposed. The Ashworth household was a model of Christian virtue, their children well-behaved and accomplished, their charitable contributions substantial and well-documented, their attendance at St. George's Church so regular that the vicar had come to depend on their presence in the front pew as a stabilizing influence during his sermons. Yet beneath this impeccable surface, Victoria struggled with doubts that had begun to surface after the birth of her youngest child, a daughter whose constant illnesses had resisted every conventional treatment and threatened to join the growing number of infant graves in the family plot at Highgate Cemetery. The fear of losing another child had opened cracks in Victoria's moral certainty, creating spaces where previously unthinkable possibilities could take root and flourish in the darkness of maternal desperation. Miss Cordelia Pemberton, unmarried at 38, and considered a spinster by society's harsh standards, supplemented her modest inheritance by serving as companion to wealthy widows, a position that afforded her intimate knowledge of their most private affairs. She had spent the better part of 2 decades moving from house to house, caring for women whose own families had either died or grown too busy with their own concerns to provide the companionship that advanced age required. In drawing rooms across London, she had listened to confessions that would never be spoken in any church, had witnessed the slow dissolution of minds that had once commanded households and directed the fates of dozens of servants, and had learned that respectability was often nothing more than a carefully maintained performance that concealed truths too uncomfortable for public consumption. Her position had given her access to secrets that more fortunate women never suspected existed, knowledge of the compromises and accommodations that allowed civilized society to function despite the primitive impulses that drove human behavior in moments of crisis or desperation. And finally, there was Mrs. Helena Blackwood, whose husband's position in the Foreign Office granted her access to information that lesser mortals could only imagine. Secrets that arrived with the diplomatic pouches and were filed away in locked cabinets that smelled of leather and sealing wax. Thomas Blackwood served as an undersecretary specializing in colonial affairs, his work requiring him to process reports from administrators, missionaries, and military officers stationed in territories where the empire's influence was maintained through methods that would have horrified the voters whose taxes funded such activities. Helena had learned, through conversations overheard and documents glimpsed, that civilization was a luxury afforded to those who could afford to remain ignorant of the violence required to maintain their comfort, and that the moral standards proclaimed from pulpits and printed in newspapers bore little resemblance to the practical realities of governing populations who had different ideas about proper behavior and acceptable losses. This knowledge had gradually eroded her faith in the absolute nature of moral law, preparing her to consider alternatives that would have been unthinkable to a woman who still believed in the fundamental goodness of the world and the reliability of conventional wisdom. Each woman had arrived at Mrs. Whitmore's door carrying a small basket covered with a pristine white cloth, the contents hidden from the curious eyes of passers-by, and each had been welcomed with the same gracious smile that had greeted 1,000 other social calls. But what they brought to this particular gathering was not the usual contribution of scones or petit fours that typically graced such occasions, nor were their baskets filled with the jellies and preserves that typically accompanied afternoon tea in respectable households. The transformation from respectable society matrons to participants in something far darker had not happened overnight, nor had it been the result of some sudden collective madness that had seized them without warning. Instead, it had been a gradual descent, each step seeming reasonable at the time, each compromise justified by circumstances that would have horrified their former selves. The seeds of their current gathering had been planted 6 months earlier, during the height of summer, when the cholera had swept through the East End like the angel of death, claiming victims with an efficiency that even the most hardened medical professionals found unsettling. The disease had struck London with particular virulence that year, overwhelming the hospitals and forcing the authorities to establish emergency morgues in warehouses and abandoned buildings throughout the poorest districts of the city. The official death toll, published weekly in the Times, recorded thousands of casualties, but those who worked among the dying knew that the true numbers were far higher, that entire families had vanished without leaving enough survivors to report their passing to the authorities. The wealthy districts had been largely spared, their residents protected by better sanitation and the ability to flee to country estates until the worst of the epidemic had passed. But even in Belgravia and Mayfair, the presence of death had made itself felt through the servants who carried news from their former neighborhoods, and the charity workers who ventured into the affected areas with medicine and prayer books. Mrs. Whitmore had been visiting the charity ward at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, fulfilling what she considered her Christian duty to the less fortunate, when she first encountered Dr. Edmund Harrow, a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow cast by a fire. He was known throughout medical circles as brilliant but unorthodox, a physician who had spent considerable time in the colonies studying what he termed native practices. Though his colleagues whispered that he had gone too far in adopting local customs and beliefs. His medical degree was from Edinburgh, his credentials impeccable, but his methods had increasingly diverged from accepted practice as he incorporated treatments and theories he had observed during his years in Africa and the Caribbean. The hospital administration tolerated his presence because his success rate with difficult cases was remarkably high, even when conventional treatments had failed, but they made sure to assign him to the charity wards where his experiments would not scandalize the paying patients whose families funded the hospital's more respectable activities. On that particular afternoon, as Mrs. Whitmore distributed prayer books and soup to the dying, she found herself drawn into conversation with the doctor about the ineffectiveness of traditional medicine in the face of such overwhelming suffering. The ward was filled with patients in various stages of decline, their bodies wasting away, despite the best efforts of nurses who had seen too much death to maintain their original optimism about the healing power of compassion and clean bedding. The smell of carbolic acid and human decay created an atmosphere that made even the most hardened visitors eager to complete their charitable obligations and return to the safety of their own neighborhoods, where death was still an occasional visitor rather than a permanent resident. Dr. Harrow moved among the patients with the confidence of a man who had made peace with mortality, checking pulses and adjusting treatments with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to suppress emotional responses that would interfere with practical decision-making. His hands, Mrs. Whitmore noticed, were stained with chemicals and scarred from years of working with substances that could burn flesh as easily as cure disease, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed suffering that would have broken lesser men. "There are older remedies," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes scanning the ward filled with moaning figures whose bodies had already begun the process of decay while their souls still clung to life. "Practices that predate our modern sensibilities but possess a power that our current medical establishment refuses to acknowledge." His words had lodged themselves in her mind like seeds in fertile soil. And over the following weeks, as she watched friends and acquaintances succumb to various ailments despite the best efforts of London's finest physicians, she found herself returning again and again to that conversation in the hospital ward. The concept of sympathetic medicine, Dr. Harrow had explained during subsequent conversations that took place in the privacy of his study rather than the public spaces of the hospital, was based on the principle that consuming specific parts of healthy subjects could transfer their vitality to those suffering from weakness or disease. The practice was ancient, predating Christianity and persisting in various forms throughout the world, despite official disapproval from medical and religious authorities who preferred treatments that could be explained through approved theories and sanctified by proper institutions. In certain regions of Africa, he had witnessed ceremonies where the hearts of warriors were consumed by their comrades, transferring courage and strength to those who would face future battles. In the Caribbean, plantation doctors had secretly prescribed similar remedies to valuable slaves, whose deaths would represent significant financial losses, though such practices were never recorded in official medical reports, and were denied whenever questions arose from visiting inspectors or curious missionaries. The theoretical basis for such treatments, according to Dr. Harrow, lay in the understanding that life force was not merely an abstract concept, but a measurable substance that could be concentrated in specific organs and transferred through careful preparation and ritual consumption. The heart, being the center of circulation and the symbol of vitality across cultures, contained the highest concentration of this life force and therefore represented the most effective source of medical intervention for patients suffering from conditions that conventional medicine could not address. When her own daughter, sweet little Constance, began showing signs of the wasting disease that had claimed so many children that summer, Mrs. Whitmore's desperation overcame her natural revulsion at Dr. Harrow's suggestions, and she found herself standing in his dimly lit study, surrounded by specimens in glass jars and books written in languages she could not read, listening as he explained the theoretical basis for what he termed sympathetic medicine. The study itself was a testament to unconventional learning, its shelves lined with volumes that would have been banned from any respectable library and artifacts that spoke of cultures whose practices challenged every assumption about proper behavior and acceptable knowledge. Skulls from various parts of the empire occupied places of honor alongside preserved organs floating in solutions that caught the lamplight and threw strange shadows on the walls, while charts depicting human anatomy were annotated with notes in scripts that seemed to writhe and dance in the flickering light. The human heart, he explained with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, contained properties that could strengthen a weakening constitution, particularly when consumed in the proper ritual context and prepared according to specific methods that had been refined over centuries by practitioners who understood the true nature of vitality and its transfer between bodies. The preparation process itself was crucial, requiring not only technical skill, but also an understanding of timing and ritual that would ensure maximum potency while minimizing the risk of contamination or spiritual interference from entities that might be attracted to such workings. The heart had to be removed shortly after death, before the life force had completely dissipated, and treated with specific preservatives that would maintain its essential properties while transforming it into a form that could be safely consumed by the living. Salt from the Dead Sea, herbs gathered during particular phases of the moon, and spices that had been blessed according to procedures that Dr. Harrow declined to explain in detail, all played roles in the transformation process, which could take anywhere from 3 days to a full week depending on the age and health of the donor and the specific requirements of the intended recipient. The finished product, when properly prepared, would resemble the finest pâtés served in London's most exclusive restaurants, its taste sufficiently pleasant to allow consumption without the revulsion that might interfere with its absorption and effectiveness. Dr. Harrow had tested his theories on himself, he admitted, consuming portions of hearts obtained from hospital morgues, and documenting the effects in journals written in code to protect both his research and his career from those who would not understand the necessity of advancing medical knowledge through any means available. The results, he claimed, had been remarkable. Increased energy, improved resistance to disease, enhanced mental clarity, and a general sense of vitality that had persisted for months after each treatment. He had also administered similar preparations to selected patients whose cases had been deemed hopeless by conventional medicine, often with results that had surprised even him, though he was careful to attribute such recoveries to more acceptable causes when discussing them with hospital administrators or medical colleagues who lacked the vision to appreciate innovative approaches to healing. Mrs. Whitmore had left that meeting carrying a small vial of powder that Dr. Harrow assured her would strengthen little Constance's constitution if administered properly, though he had been deliberately vague about its contents and method of preparation, suggesting only that it represented the concentrated essence of vitality obtained through methods too advanced for popular understanding. The powder itself was unremarkable in appearance, resembling nothing so much as the medicinal preparations that could be purchased from any respectable apothecary. Its color, a deep reddish-brown that spoke of iron content and careful processing. She had administered it to Constance mixed with honey and warm milk, explaining to the child that it was a special medicine from the continent that would help restore her strength and energy. Within days, the improvement had been remarkable. Constance's appetite returned, her color improved, and the listless behavior that had worried her mother for weeks began to give way to the normal activity of a healthy child. The transformation had been so dramatic that Mrs. Whitmore found herself forced to reconsider her assumptions about the nature of medicine and healing, opening her mind to possibilities that her upbringing and education had taught her to dismiss as superstition or worse. When she returned to Dr. Harrow to express her gratitude and request additional doses of the miraculous powder, he had smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose theories had been vindicated by practical results, and suggested that she might be interested in learning to prepare such remedies herself, should she prove capable of overcoming the squeamishness that prevented most people from taking advantage of treatments that were both effective and readily available to those with the courage to embrace unconventional wisdom. The first heart had come from the morgue at St. Bartholomew's, obtained through Dr. Harrow's connections with the hospital's less scrupulous attendants, men who understood that the dead had no use for their organs, and that the living would pay handsomely for what others considered mere carrion. The attendant who had provided it, a thin man named Morrison, whose years of working among corpses had given him a perspective on mortality that would have horrified his neighbors, had been carefully selected by Dr. Harrow for his discretion and his willingness to supplement his meager hospital wages through activities that were not technically illegal, but would certainly have cost him his position if discovered by the hospital's administrators. Morrison had served as a battlefield surgeon's assistant during the Crimean War, where he had learned that human flesh was merely another form of matter that could be useful or worthless, depending on the circumstances and the needs of those who controlled its disposition. His experiences cleaning battlefield hospitals and disposing of amputated limbs had stripped away whatever romantic notions he might once have held about the sanctity of human remains, leaving him with a practical understanding that dead tissue could serve the living in ways that the living preferred not to acknowledge or discuss in polite company. The heart he provided had belonged to a young woman who had died of consumption, her body donated to the hospital by a family too poor to afford a proper burial, and too desperate to care what happened to her remains, as long as they were spared the expense of a funeral that would have consumed their savings for months to come. She had been perhaps 20 years old, her death certificate recording her name as Mary Catherine Sullivan and her occupation as seamstress, though Morrison knew nothing of her life beyond the clinical details recorded by the medical students who had used her body to practice procedures they would later perform on living patients wealthy enough to pay for proper medical care. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared it herself in her own kitchen, long after the servants had retired for the evening. Following the doctor's precise instructions with the same attention to detail she had once applied to household management and social correspondence. The process had required her to overcome revulsion that ran deeper than mere squeamishness, forcing her to confront the reality of what she was doing while maintaining the technical precision necessary for success. The heart itself, when she unwrapped it from Morrison's careful packaging, had been smaller than she expected, its surface, the color of raw liver, and its texture similar to the kidneys she had occasionally prepared for her late husband's breakfast during their years in the colonies. The preparation itself involved removing the major vessels and trimming away fat and connective tissue, work that required the same skills she had once applied to preparing game birds during their years in Jamaica, though the psychological impact was entirely different from anything she had experienced while working with conventional ingredients. The grinding process, accomplished with a meat grinder borrowed from the kitchen and thoroughly cleaned before and after use, reduced the trimmed heart to a consistency suitable for mixing with the preservatives Dr. Harrow had provided, creating a mixture that resembled nothing so much as the finest forcemeat used in luxury pâtés. The preservation process itself took 3 days of careful attention, requiring regular stirring and the addition of ingredients at precisely timed intervals, transforming the raw tissue into something that could be stored safely and consumed without immediate revulsion. The final product, when completed according to Dr. Harrow's specifications, had been indistinguishable from the imported delicacies that regularly appeared on the tables of London's wealthy, its texture smooth, and its flavor rich enough to be enjoyed rather than merely tolerated. When little Constance consumed her first portion, spread thinly on toast points and accompanied by her usual cup of milk, she showed no signs of distaste or suspicion, accepting her mother's explanation that it was a new medicine from the continent that would help restore her strength. The child's innocent consumption of what Mrs. Whitmore knew to be human flesh had been both a triumph and a source of profound moral disturbance, forcing her to confront the extent to which love could justify actions that would have horrified her former self. Within a week, the child's color had improved noticeably, her appetite returned, and the terrible cough that had kept the household awake for months began to subside, leaving Mrs. Whitmore to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that Dr. Harrow's unorthodox remedy appeared to be working where conventional treatments had failed. The improvement continued over the following weeks, with Constance regaining the energy and curiosity that had characterized her personality before the illness struck, her recovery so complete that the family physician expressed amazement at the effectiveness of whatever continental remedy Mrs. Whitmore had discovered through her charitable work among foreign communities. The success had been intoxicating in its completeness, providing not only relief from the immediate crisis, but also a sense of power that Mrs. Whitmore had never previously experienced. The knowledge that she possessed access to methods of healing that were beyond the reach of conventional medical practice, and the social structures that controlled such practice. Word of Constance's recovery spread through the interconnected web of relationships that bound London's upper classes together, reaching the ears of other desperate mothers whose children suffered from ailments that defied conventional treatment, and soon Mrs. Whitmore found herself receiving discreet inquiries from women who had heard whispered rumors about her daughter's miraculous recovery, and wondered whether she might be willing to share the secret of her success. The first of these inquiries had come from Lady Thornfield, whose grief over her son's death had been compounded by the declining health of her surviving daughter, Emily, a girl of 16 whose constitution seemed to be failing despite the best efforts of London's most expensive physicians. Emily had been languishing for months, her energy sapped by an illness that resisted diagnosis and treatment, her parents watching helplessly as she grew thinner and weaker with each passing day. Lady Thornfield's desperation had overcome her natural reserve, leading her to approach Mrs. Whitmore after a church service where she had noticed the remarkable improvement in young Constance's appearance and demeanor. The conversation that followed had been conducted in the carefully coded language that respectable women used when discussing topics that approached the boundaries of acceptable discourse, with Lady Thornfield inquiring about continental remedies and unconventional treatments, while Mrs. Whitmore responded with references to advanced medical theories and innovative approaches to healing that had proved effective where traditional methods had failed. The mutual understanding that emerged from this delicate exchange had been based not on explicit agreement, but on shared desperation, and the recognition that both women had reached a point where conventional morality seemed less important than the practical needs of their children. Mrs. Whitmore had agreed to share her knowledge with Lady Thornfield, beginning with theoretical discussions that gradually progressed to practical instruction in the methods Dr. Harrow had taught her, though she had been careful to introduce each step slowly and to ensure that her new pupil fully understood the implications of what she was learning before proceeding to the next stage of instruction. The recruitment of Mrs. Ashworth had followed a different pattern, emerging from a chance encounter at a ladies' charity meeting, where the conversation had turned to the inadequacy of conventional medicine in addressing the needs of the poor and suffering. Mrs. Ashworth had been particularly vocal in her criticism of physicians who seemed more interested in collecting fees than in actually healing their patients, expressing frustration with the limited options available to mothers whose children faced illnesses that conventional treatment could not address. Her comments had caught Mrs. Whitmore's attention, suggesting a woman whose moral certainty might be flexible enough to accommodate alternatives that others would reject without consideration, and the subsequent private conversation had revealed that Mrs. Ashworth's youngest daughter was suffering from a condition that had already claimed one of her children and threatened to claim another. The theological discussions that had occupied much of their early relationship had focused on the relationship between divine providence and human agency, with both women exploring the possibility that God might work through methods that seemed unconventional to those with limited understanding of His purposes. Mrs. Ashworth's religious background had initially made her resistant to Dr. Harrow's theories, but her desperation as a mother had eventually overcome her theological objections, particularly when Mrs. Whitmore was able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the treatments through the evident health and vitality of her own daughter. The process of converting Mrs. Ashworth to their cause had required careful attention to her religious concerns, with extensive discussions about the precedents for unconventional healing methods found in biblical accounts and early Christian practices that had been suppressed by institutional authorities, more interested in maintaining control than in preserving effective treatments for human suffering. Miss Pemberton had been drawn into their circle through her professional relationship with one of Lady Thornfield's elderly acquaintances, a wealthy widow whose declining health had brought her into contact with various unconventional practitioners and experimental treatments that more respectable physicians would not consider. Through her work as a companion, Miss Pemberton had observed the limitations of conventional medicine when applied to the complex needs of elderly patients whose conditions often resisted standard treatment protocols, and she had also witnessed the effectiveness of remedies that could not be explained through accepted medical theory, but nevertheless produced results that were difficult to dismiss. Her position had given her access to information about alternative healing practices that were available to those with sufficient resources and discretion to pursue them, and she had been particularly intrigued by reports of treatments that seemed to reverse the effects of aging and restore vitality to patients who had been considered beyond help. When Lady Thornfield began to show signs of improved health and energy after beginning her association with Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Pemberton had been quick to recognize the potential benefits of whatever treatment was responsible for the transformation, and her discretion and practical nature had made her an ideal candidate for inclusion in their growing circle of practitioners. Mrs. Blackwood's recruitment had been the most complex, requiring careful cultivation over a period of several months, as Mrs. Whitmore worked to establish the level of trust necessary to approach such a sensitive subject, with the wife of a government official whose position required absolute discretion regarding any activities that might be considered controversial or inappropriate. The initial approach had been made through mutual friends who had noticed the remarkable health and vitality displayed by the other members of their circle, with casual inquiries about their secrets for maintaining such energy and resilience in the face of London's demanding social season. Mrs. Blackwood's husband's work in the Foreign Office had exposed her to information about practices and beliefs that were common in other parts of the world, but were considered unacceptable within the boundaries of Christian civilization, giving her a broader perspective on cultural variation in acceptable behavior and a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between official policy and practical necessity. Her position had also provided her with access to intelligence about unconventional methods used by government agents and military personnel in situations where conventional approaches were inadequate to address the challenges they faced, including reports of colonial administrators who had adopted local practices in order to maintain their health and effectiveness in hostile environments. The combination of her exposure to classified information and her recognition of the benefits displayed by Mrs. Whitmore's circle had eventually overcome her initial reluctance to consider participating in activities that might be misunderstood by those without access to the broader context that made such activities not only acceptable, but necessary for those who understood the true nature of the challenges facing civilization. The Tea Party tradition had emerged naturally from these clandestine meetings, born from the practical need to disguise the true nature of their gatherings behind the respectable facade of social calling that no servant or neighbor would question. The format itself provided the perfect cover for activities that would have aroused suspicion if conducted in any other context, allowing the women to meet regularly without attracting attention from those who might not understand the medical necessity that drove their activities. Each woman contributed to the communal supply according to her means and connections, with Dr. Harrow serving as their primary source of raw materials and technical expertise, while Mrs. Whitmore's kitchen became the laboratory where hearts procured from various sources were transformed into the preserves and spreads that now graced their afternoon table. The process had become ritualized over time, with each step carefully codified to ensure both effectiveness and discretion, from the initial procurement through the complex preparation process to the final consumption in the civilized setting of Mrs. Whitmore's parlor. They had learned through careful experimentation that hearts from younger subjects proved more potent than those from the elderly, that preparation during certain phases of the moon enhanced the final product's efficacy, and that consumption in groups of 5 or fewer reduced the likelihood of detection while maintaining the ritual's power. The selection of donors had become increasingly sophisticated as their experience grew, with Dr. Harrow developing criteria that took into account not only the age and health of potential sources, but also factors such as the circumstances of death and the time elapsed between death and procurement, variables that could significantly affect the quality and potency of the final product. The sources themselves had diversified beyond the hospital morgue as their needs grew and their network of contacts expanded, with Morrison introducing them to attendants at other medical facilities and funeral homes whose directors were willing to overlook irregular inventory management in exchange for contributions that supplemented their legitimate income. The expansion of their supply network had required careful vetting of potential collaborators, ensuring that each new contact understood both the lucrative nature of the arrangement and the devastating consequences that would follow any breach of security that might expose their activities to unwelcome scrutiny. Morrison had proved particularly valuable in this regard, his military background and years of working in environments where discretion was essential having given him the skills necessary to evaluate the reliability and trustworthiness of potential recruits while minimizing the risk of exposure through careless expansion of their operation. The quality control measures they had implemented ensured that each heart met their increasingly refined standards, with detailed records kept regarding the source, preparation method, and effectiveness of each batch, information that was coded and stored in ways that would appear meaningless to casual observers, but provided essential data for optimizing their procedures and maximizing the benefits obtained from their consumption. The financial arrangements that supported their activities had been structured to provide plausible explanations for any unusual expenses, while ensuring that their collaborators remained motivated to maintain the security and reliability of their services, with payments made through indirect channels that would be difficult to trace should questions ever arise about the destination of funds withdrawn from household accounts or charitable contributions. The women themselves had changed in subtle ways over the months since their first tentative experiments with Dr. Harrow's unconventional medicine, their complexions taking on a healthier glow that their friends attributed to the benefits of clean living and moral rectitude, their energy levels increasing to the point where they found themselves capable of social and charitable activities that would have exhausted their former selves. The transformation had been gradual enough to avoid arousing suspicion, with each woman's improvement attributed to conventional causes, such as better weather, improved diet, or recovery from the stresses that had previously affected their health and appearance. Their children, too, had thrived under this unusual regimen, developing immune systems so robust that they seemed impervious to the diseases that regularly swept through London's population, their growth so rapid and healthy that other parents sought out Mrs. Whitmore and her circle for advice on child-rearing and health maintenance. The academic performance of their children had improved markedly, with teachers commenting on increased attention spans and enhanced learning capabilities that suggested improved brain function resulting from their unusual dietary supplements. The physical development of the children had been equally impressive, with growth rates and strength gains that exceeded normal expectations and attracted favorable comment from physicians who examined them during routine visits, though the doctors naturally attributed these improvements to excellent general care rather than any specific dietary intervention that might have raised uncomfortable questions about the methods being employed. But perhaps the most significant change was in their perspective on morality itself, as each successful gathering eroded their former squeamishness and replaced it with a more pragmatic understanding of survival and the lengths to which loving mothers would go to protect their families from the countless threats that stalked the children of even the wealthy and well-connected. The moral framework that had once governed their behavior had been gradually replaced by a utilitarian calculus that weighed benefits against costs without reference to abstract principles that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of practical challenges that required practical solutions. They had learned to compartmentalize their activities, maintaining their public roles as pillars of respectable society, while privately acknowledging that respectability itself was merely a performance designed to maintain social order rather than an accurate reflection of the moral complexity that characterized actual human behavior. The cognitive dissonance that might have troubled their former selves had been resolved through the simple expedient of recognizing that different situations required different standards of behavior, and that the protection of their families justified actions that would be inappropriate in other contexts but were not only acceptable but necessary given the specific circumstances they faced. Their theological understanding had evolved to accommodate their new practices, with extensive discussions about the nature of divine will and the possibility that God might work through methods that seemed unconventional to those with limited understanding of his purposes. leading them to conclude that their activities represented a form of stewardship that maximized the use of resources that would otherwise be wasted while providing benefits that could be obtained through no other means available to them. The social dynamics within their group had developed a complexity that reflected both their shared commitment to their unusual dietary practices and the individual personalities and backgrounds that each woman brought to their collective enterprise. Mrs. Whitmore's role as hostess and pioneer in their activities had established her as the informal leader of their circle, though she was careful to maintain the democratic facade that characterized proper social interaction among women of their class. Her knowledge of the preparation processes and her relationship with Dr. Harrow made her indispensable to their operations, while her experience with the practical and psychological challenges of their transformation provided guidance that helped the others navigate the moral and emotional difficulties inherent in their new lifestyle. Lady Thornfield's grief-driven motivation had made her the most zealous advocate for expanding their activities and recruiting additional members, her aristocratic background providing social connections that could prove valuable for future growth, while her personal experience with loss made her particularly sensitive to the potential of their methods for preventing similar tragedies in other families. Her willingness to take risks had sometimes created tension within the group, particularly when her enthusiasm for their cause threatened to compromise the security that was essential for their continued operation, requiring careful management from the other members to ensure that her passion did not endanger their collective safety. Mrs. Ashworth's religious concerns had made her the group's unofficial theologian, developing the scriptural and doctrinal justifications that allowed them to reconcile their activities with their Christian beliefs and their positions in church and charitable organizations. Her husband's political connections had also provided valuable intelligence about government attitudes toward unconventional medical practices and the likelihood of official interference with their activities, information that had proved crucial for maintaining their security and avoiding the attention of authorities who might not understand the medical necessity that drove their actions. Miss Pemberton's professional experience as a companion had given her insights into the aging process and the potential for their methods to address age-related decline, making her particularly valuable for identifying potential clients among the wealthy elderly who might benefit from their treatments while possessing the resources and desperation necessary to overcome moral objections to unconventional methods. Her access to the private medical records and personal histories of numerous wealthy families had provided intelligence that proved invaluable for target selection and risk assessment, ensuring that their recruitment efforts focused on individuals whose circumstances made them both suitable candidates and unlikely sources of security breaches that could compromise their operations. Mrs. Blackwood's government connections had proved the most complex to navigate, her husband's position requiring absolute discretion, while simultaneously providing access to information that enhanced both their security and their understanding of official attitudes toward their activities. Her knowledge of intelligence gathering and counterintelligence methods had been instrumental in developing the security protocols that protected their operations from discovery, while her understanding of government decision-making processes had helped them anticipate and avoid potential threats to their continued activities. The procurement network that supported their operations had evolved into a sophisticated system that leveraged the connections and resources of each member, while maintaining the compartmentalization necessary to protect individual participants from exposure should any part of the network be compromised. Morrison remained their primary source of hospital-acquired materials, his position giving him access to a steady supply of fresh hearts from patients who died during the night hours when fewer staff members were present to monitor the disposition of remains. His military background had proved invaluable for establishing security protocols and recruiting additional contacts within London's medical establishment, men whose wartime experiences had stripped away squeamishness about handling human remains, and whose current financial circumstances made them receptive to arrangements that supplemented their modest institutional salaries. The funeral homes that had joined their network operated according to different principles, their contribution based on the understanding that families who could not afford elaborate burial services were unlikely to notice or question minor discrepancies in the preparation of remains that would be buried, rather than displayed for extended viewing. The directors of these establishments had been carefully selected based on their financial vulnerabilities and their demonstrated willingness to overlook irregularities in exchange for contributions that helped them maintain their businesses during economically challenging periods when many families were forced to choose the least expensive burial options available. Dr. Harrow's role had expanded beyond merely providing technical expertise and initial contacts, evolving into a position that combined research coordination, quality assurance, and strategic planning for their long-term objectives. His studies of sympathetic medicine had continued in parallel with their practical applications, with detailed documentation of the effects observed in their subjects providing data that advanced his understanding of the theoretical principles underlying their treatments. The journal he maintained, written in a cipher of his own design, recorded not only the practical details of procurement and preparation, but also his observations regarding optimal dosages, timing of administration, and the variables that seemed to influence effectiveness in different subjects. His experiments with preservation techniques had led to significant improvements in both the shelf life and potency of their preparations, allowing them to maintain larger inventories and reducing the pressure to consume materials immediately after preparation. The development of more sophisticated preparation methods had also enabled them to create products that were more palatable and easier to disguise as conventional foods, reducing the psychological barriers that might otherwise interfere with consumption, and making it easier to administer treatments to subjects who were not fully informed about the nature of what they were receiving. The expansion of their activities had required increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining their cover identities and explaining the improvements in health and vitality that marked them as different from their peers. The charitable work that had initially served as a convenient explanation for their contacts with medical personnel and morgue attendants had been systematized into a comprehensive program of social service that provided both legitimate purposes for their activities and opportunities to identify potential subjects for treatment or recruitment. Their involvement in hospital visiting programs allowed them to observe patients whose conditions might make them suitable donors, while establishing relationships with medical staff who could provide information about upcoming deaths and the disposition of remains. Their work with orphanages and homes for the elderly provided access to populations whose deaths would be less likely to attract attention or investigation, while their participation in charitable boards gave them influence over policies regarding the handling of bodies that had no family members to oversee burial arrangements. The fundraising activities that supported these charitable works also provided opportunities to evaluate the financial resources and personal vulnerabilities of potential recruits, with careful attention paid to identifying women whose circumstances might make them receptive to unconventional solutions to health problems that conventional medicine could not address. The children who benefited from their treatments had become living advertisements for the effectiveness of their methods, though the women were careful to attribute their remarkable health and development to conventional factors that would not arouse suspicion or invite unwelcome inquiries about their care regimens. The academic achievements of these children had attracted favorable attention from educators who noted their exceptional memory, concentration, and analytical abilities, qualities that the mothers attributed to excellent nutrition and careful attention to educational development, rather than dietary supplements that enhanced brain function through mechanisms that conventional medicine did not recognize or understand. The physical development of the children had been equally impressive, with strength and endurance that exceeded normal expectations for their age groups, leading to success in athletic competitions and physical activities that enhanced their social standing, while providing additional evidence of the benefits their mothers had gained through their unconventional dietary practices. The social skills and emotional maturity displayed by these children had also attracted comment from adults who interacted with them, with teachers and family friends noting their confidence, poise, and unusual wisdom that seemed advanced beyond their chronological years, qualities that their mothers knew resulted from the enhanced neural development that was one of the documented effects of regular consumption of properly prepared human brain tissue, though this particular ingredient was reserved for special occasions and administered only in very small quantities due to the difficulty of procurement and the extreme sensitivity. The psychological adaptation that had allowed them to normalize their activities had been perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their transformation, requiring each woman to construct new frameworks for understanding morality, identity, and social responsibility that could accommodate actions their former selves would have found unthinkable. The process had been gradual but thorough, beginning with intellectual acceptance of Dr. Harrow's theories about sympathetic medicine and progressing through practical experimentation to the point where the consumption of human flesh had become as routine as any other aspect of household management or childcare. The compartmentalization that enabled them to maintain their public roles while privately engaging in activities that would horrify their social circles had required sophisticated psychological mechanisms that separated their various identities and allowed them to function effectively in different contexts without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that might otherwise have undermined their effectiveness in either sphere. They had learned to think of themselves as pioneers in advanced medical treatment, rather than participants in activities that others might consider aberrant or criminal, focusing on the beneficial outcomes of their work, rather than the social taboos they had violated in achieving those outcomes. The religious accommodation that had been necessary for Mrs. Ashworth and others with strong theological commitments had resulted in a sophisticated interpretation of Christian doctrine that emphasized the primacy of loving care for family members over abstract moral principles that might prevent effective intervention in life-threatening situations. Their theological discussions had explored precedents for unconventional healing methods in biblical accounts and early Christian practices, with particular attention to passages that suggested divine approval for actions that might seem irregular but were motivated by compassion and necessity rather than selfish interest or malicious intent. The concept of stewardship had proved particularly useful for justifying their use of materials that would otherwise be wasted, with the argument that God had provided these resources for human benefit and that failing to use them effectively would represent a form of ingratitude that was itself morally questionable. The notion that different circumstances might require different applications of moral principles had allowed them to maintain their Christian identities while acknowledging that the protection of innocent children might justify actions that would be inappropriate in other contexts but were not only acceptable but required given their specific situation and the alternatives available to them. The financial aspects of their operations had been managed with the same attention to security and plausible deniability that characterized their other activities, with expenses distributed across multiple household budgets and explained through conventional categories that would not attract attention from husbands, accountants, or household staff who might question unusual expenditures. As the payments made to Morrison and other members of their procurement network were disguised as charitable contributions, medical expenses, or household purchases that fell within the normal range of spending for women of their social position. The equipment and supplies required for their preparation processes were acquired through legitimate channels that served conventional cooking and household management needs, with the special ingredients provided by Dr. Harrow being the only items that could not be explained through normal domestic requirements. The cost-benefit analysis of their activities strongly favored continued investment, with the medical expenses they had avoided through improved family health far exceeding the amounts spent on procurement and preparation, while the enhanced quality of life experienced by their children and themselves represented value that could not be quantified in purely financial terms but clearly justified the resources devoted to maintaining their unusual dietary regimen. As the afternoon progressed and the conversation flowed with the same genteel rhythm that had characterized countless other social gatherings, the women discussed the usual topics that occupied their class: the shocking state of the poor, the latest fashions from Paris, the political situation in America where a civil war raged with unprecedented savagery, and the ongoing troubles in various corners of the empire where ungrateful subjects required periodic reminders of their proper place in the natural order. The war in America had been particularly useful as a source of materials for their activities, with Dr. Harrow's contacts among military surgeons providing access to hearts removed from soldiers who had died in field hospitals, where record-keeping was often incomplete, and the disposition of remains was necessarily hasty and informal. The battlefield conditions that characterized much of the conflict had created opportunities for procurement that would not have been available during peacetime, with the massive casualties overwhelming normal procedures for handling the dead and creating situations where missing organs were unlikely to be noticed or investigated by authorities whose primary concern was disposing of bodies quickly enough to prevent disease outbreaks that could devastate surviving troops. Lady Thornfield mentioned that her physician had recommended a sea voyage for her constitution, though she confided that she was reluctant to leave London now that she had finally found a social circle that truly understood her needs and concerns. The prospect of extended travel had raised questions about maintaining her dietary regimen while absent from their established procurement network, leading to discussions about the possibility of identifying sources in other cities or developing preservation techniques that would allow her to transport sufficient supplies to maintain her health during extended periods away from London. Mrs. Ashworth reported that her youngest son had been accepted at Eton, a triumph she attributed to the excellent health he had enjoyed over the past several months, his increased energy and mental acuity having enabled him to excel in the demanding examinations required for admission to the prestigious institution. The boy's performance had exceeded even her elevated expectations, with his tutors commenting on his exceptional memory and analytical abilities that seemed to improve with each month that passed since beginning his supplemented diet. His physical development had been equally impressive, with growth spurts that had required frequent replacement of clothing and athletic abilities that had attracted favorable attention from instructors who evaluated candidates for admission to institutions that valued both academic achievement and physical prowess. The social confidence that had accompanied these improvements had been perhaps the most significant benefit, transforming a shy and somewhat sickly child into a young man whose presence commanded respect from both peers and adults, qualities that would serve him well throughout his educational career and beyond. Miss Pemberton shared the news that her elderly charge, the Dowager Countess of Fairfax, had finally succumbed to the pneumonia that had troubled her for weeks, leaving behind a substantial bequest that would ensure Miss Pemberton's financial security for years to come. The Countess's death had been expected for some time, her advanced age and declining health making recovery unlikely, despite the best efforts of London's most expensive physicians, and Miss Pemberton had been careful to ensure that her final weeks were as comfortable as possible, while also documenting the progression of her condition for potential future reference regarding the effects of aging on various organ systems. The bequest itself had been larger than expected, reflecting both the Countess's satisfaction with Miss Pemberton's care and her lack of close family members who might have contested the generous provision made for her companion. The financial independence that resulted from this inheritance would allow Miss Pemberton to be more selective about her future employment, while also providing resources that could support the expansion of their activities or the development of new techniques that might enhance the effectiveness of their treatments. Mrs. Blackwood spoke in carefully coded language about certain developments in the Foreign Office that suggested the Empire's reach would soon extend into territories that had previously been considered too remote or hostile for British influence, opportunities that would no doubt benefit those with the foresight to position themselves advantageously. Her husband's work had provided intelligence about military campaigns that were being planned for regions where local populations practiced forms of medicine that were similar in some respects to the methods they had adopted, suggesting possibilities for expanding their knowledge and techniques through contact with practitioners whose experience with sympathetic medicine was more extensive than what was available through European sources. The prospect of establishing connections with traditional healers in colonial territories had excited Dr. Harrow, who had long suspected that his theoretical understanding could be enhanced through direct contact with practitioners whose methods had been refined over centuries of continuous practice, rather than the intermittent experimentation that characterized his own approach to these techniques. Through it all, they continued to consume their unusual afternoon refreshment with the same refined manners that had been drilled into them since childhood, their pinkies extended as they lifted their teacups, their conversation never dropping below the level of civilized discourse that marked them as ladies of breeding and education. The physical act of consumption had become as routine as breathing, requiring no conscious attention or effort to overcome instinctive revulsion that had been systematically eliminated through gradual exposure and psychological conditioning that had reshaped their fundamental responses to activities that would have horrified their former selves. The taste itself had been refined through experimentation with different preparation techniques and seasoning combinations, until it was not merely tolerable but actually enjoyable, resembling the finest imported delicacies that graced the tables of London's most exclusive restaurants. The social ritual that surrounded their consumption had been carefully designed to reinforce their shared identity while maintaining the civilized atmosphere that was essential for their psychological comfort and security, allowing them to engage in activities that violated fundamental social taboos while preserving the sense of respectability and moral superiority that was central to their self-concept and social position. The irony was not lost on any of them that their current activities would be considered barbaric by the very society that had shaped their manners and values. Yet none questioned the necessity of what they had come to see as a logical extension of their maternal duties and social responsibilities. The disconnect between public perception and private reality had become a source of sophisticated amusement rather than moral distress, evidence of their superior understanding of human nature and social dynamics that allowed them to navigate complex situations that would confuse or destroy those with less flexibility and insight. They had learned to view conventional morality as a useful tool for managing the behavior of ordinary people, rather than a binding constraint on those whose responsibilities and opportunities required more sophisticated approaches to ethical decision-making, a perspective that allowed them to maintain their sense of moral superiority while engaging in activities that others would consider deeply immoral. The education and breeding that had prepared them for leadership in civilized society had also provided them with the intellectual tools necessary to construct justifications for their behavior that satisfied their need for moral consistency while accommodating the practical requirements of their situation, creating cognitive frameworks that allowed them to maintain their identities as virtuous women, while acknowledging that virtue itself might require actions that appeared vicious to those with less complete understanding of the circumstances that motivated such actions. The source of their afternoon's repast had been particularly fresh, procured just 2 days earlier from the private morgue that served the city's more exclusive medical practitioners, a facility where the wealthy could ensure that their deceased family members received more dignified treatment than the common graves and paupers, fields that claimed most of London's dead. The morgue itself was operated according to the highest standards of professional discretion, with elaborate security measures designed to protect the privacy of families whose social standing required careful handling of sensitive matters related to death and burial. The staff members who worked in such facilities were carefully screened for trustworthiness and bound by confidentiality agreements that were enforced through both legal and financial mechanisms, creating an environment where irregular activities could be conducted with minimal risk of exposure to unwelcome scrutiny. Dr. Harrow had explained that this particular heart had belonged to a young woman of good family who had succumbed to consumption, her death mourned by parents who had spared no expense in seeking treatment for their beloved daughter. The victim's medical history had been exemplary, with no indication of disease or condition that might have compromised the quality of her organs, and her death had occurred under circumstances that ensured optimal preservation of the materials that would eventually find their way to Mrs. Whitmore's table. The family's wealth had ensured that she had received the best possible medical care during her final illness, with treatments that had maintained her general health even as the consumption progressed to its inevitable conclusion, leaving her other organs in excellent condition despite the pulmonary damage that had ultimately caused her death. The victim's identity was known to the women around the table, though by unspoken agreement they never discussed such details during their gatherings, preferring to maintain the fiction that their consumption was somehow abstract and disconnected from the human cost of their activities. The young woman had been named Catherine Pembroke, daughter of a merchant banker whose financial success had elevated his family to the margins of respectable society, though their recent wealth lacked the generational depth that would have secured them a place in the established social hierarchy. Catherine had been 19 years old at the time of her death, engaged to be married to the younger son of a baronet, her future promising the kind of social advancement that represented the highest aspirations of families whose fortunes were based on commerce rather than inheritance. Her consumption had been particularly tragic because it had struck just as her life was beginning to fulfill its early promise, cutting short a career in society that had already attracted favorable attention from matrons whose approval could determine the success or failure of a young woman's social ambitions. The loss of such potential had made her death particularly poignant for those who had known her, while also making her heart particularly valuable for the women who now consumed it. The youth and vitality that had been extinguished by disease being transferred to those who had the knowledge and determination necessary to benefit from her misfortune. Yet each understood that somewhere in London, a family was grieving the loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone whose absence would be felt for years to come by those who had loved her, while her heart now sustained the health and vitality of women she had never met, and whose names would remain forever unknown to her surviving relatives. The Pembroke family's grief had been genuine and profound. with her father's business associates noting the dramatic change in his demeanor following Catherine's death, and her mother retreating into mourning that showed no signs of ending even months after the funeral. The young man who had been engaged to marry her had eventually broken off the engagement under circumstances that suggested his feelings had been deeper than the practical considerations that typically motivated such arrangements among families of their social level, his continued bachelorhood serving as a monument to love that had been destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. This uncomfortable truth lay beneath their polite conversation like a serpent coiled in a garden, acknowledged by its very denial, given power by their collective refusal to confront the full implications of their actions. They told themselves stories to make the truth more palatable, that the dead had no use for their organs, that their activities harmed no one who still drew breath, that the benefits to their own families justified the means by which those benefits were obtained. The rationalization process had become as sophisticated as their preparation techniques, with elaborate philosophical frameworks that transformed their activities from violations of social taboos into expressions of wisdom that transcended conventional moral limitations through superior understanding of natural laws and human needs. But in the quiet moments between conversation, when the afternoon light slanted through the windows and cast shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the wallpaper's pastoral scenes, each woman grappled privately with the knowledge of what they had become, and wondered how many more such gatherings would be necessary before their transformations were complete. The question of completion itself was complex, involving both practical considerations about the duration of treatment required to maintain their enhanced health and philosophical questions about the nature of identity and moral development that had been raised by their experiences over the past months. Some days the weight of their actions seemed insignificant compared to the benefits they had gained, while other moments brought flashes of horror at the realization of how far they had traveled from the women they had once been, journeys that had been undertaken step by step until the distance covered was too great to contemplate returning to their starting points. The psychological adaptation that had enabled their transformation had been so gradual and thorough that they sometimes struggled to remember what it had felt like to inhabit their former moral frameworks, as if their previous selves had been different people whose concerns and limitations seemed increasingly irrelevant to their current situation and understanding. The conversation eventually turned, as it always did during their gatherings, to practical matters related to their unusual dietary requirements, though they discussed these topics with the same euphemistic delicacy they might apply to any other household management concern. The language they had developed for these discussions represented a sophisticated code that allowed detailed planning while maintaining plausible deniability should their conversations ever be overheard by servants or visitors who might not understand the true nature of their activities. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that Dr. Harrow had acquired new contacts among the city's undertakers and hospital staff, expanding their potential sources of supply to ensure consistent availability regardless of seasonal variations in mortality rates. The expansion of their network had been planned carefully to avoid the security risks that might result from too rapid growth, with each new contact being evaluated for reliability and discretion before being granted access to information that could compromise their operations if shared with inappropriate parties. The undertakers who had joined their network operated establishments that served populations whose deaths were less likely to attract official attention or investigation, while the hospital contacts were positioned in facilities where record-keeping procedures were sufficiently flexible to accommodate minor discrepancies in inventory management without triggering administrative reviews. Lady Thornfield inquired about the possibility of establishing connections in other cities, noting that her deceased husband's business associates in Edinburgh and Dublin might prove useful should their circle decide to expand beyond London's boundaries. The prospect of geographic expansion had been discussed previously, though the logistical challenges of maintaining quality control and security across multiple locations had raised concerns that needed to be addressed before serious planning could begin. The establishment of remote operations would require trusted local contacts whose reliability could be verified through existing network members, along with communication protocols that would allow coordination of activities without creating documentary evidence that might compromise security if intercepted by hostile parties. The potential benefits of expansion were substantial, including access to different populations whose medical conditions and demographic characteristics might provide materials with enhanced properties, as well as reduced dependence on London sources that might become unavailable due to changes in personnel or institutional policies that could disrupt their established procurement channels. Mrs. Ashworth suggested that they consider recruiting additional members from among their social circle, carefully vetted women whose desperation and discretion could be trusted to maintain the secrecy that their activities required, while Miss Pemberton warned against growing too quickly or attracting attention from authorities who might not understand the medical necessity that drove their actions. The recruitment process that had brought their current members together had been lengthy and careful, involving months of evaluation and gradual introduction to concepts that might initially seem shocking or inappropriate to women whose moral frameworks had not been prepared through the kind of personal crisis that had motivated their own initial interest in unconventional treatments. The identification of suitable candidates required intimate knowledge of their personal circumstances, medical needs, and psychological characteristics that would determine their ability to adapt to activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about acceptable behavior, information that could only be obtained through sustained social contact, and careful observation of their responses to various forms of stress and moral ambiguity. Mrs. Blackwood shared intelligence from her husband's office regarding certain government officials whose own unusual proclivities might make them sympathetic to their cause, or, alternatively, vulnerable to the kind of pressure that could ensure their protection from official scrutiny. The intelligence gathering that supported their security planning had become increasingly sophisticated as their understanding of potential threats evolved, and their resources for addressing those threats expanded beyond simple secrecy to include more active measures for managing hostile attention, should their activities be discovered by parties who might not appreciate the medical benefits that justified their methods. The identification of officials whose personal behaviors created vulnerabilities that could be exploited for protective purposes had required careful research into the private lives and secret activities of individuals whose public positions gave them authority over law enforcement and regulatory policies that could affect their operations. The development of leverage over such officials represented a form of insurance that could prove invaluable if their activities ever attracted unwelcome official attention, though the use of such leverage would need to be managed carefully to avoid creating additional security risks through the establishment of relationships that might themselves become sources of exposure or blackmail. As they spoke, their voices remained pitched at the same refined level that had characterized the entire afternoon, their language carefully chosen to avoid crude directness while maintaining perfect mutual understanding, their manners as impeccable as if they were discussing flower arrangements or charitable fundraising, rather than the systematic acquisition and consumption of human organs. The mastery of this sophisticated communication style had been one of the most challenging aspects of their adaptation to their new lifestyle, requiring the development of vocabulary and conversational techniques that could address highly sensitive topics without violating the social protocols that governed interaction among women of their class. The ability to discuss procurement schedules, preparation techniques, and consumption preferences using the same linguistic structures and emotional tones that characterized conventional social conversation had been essential for maintaining their psychological comfort and social identities while engaging in activities that would normally require entirely different modes of expression and interpersonal interaction. The normalcy of the setting made their conversation all the more chilling, proof that even the most civilized veneer could conceal appetites that would have horrified their ancestors and shocked their contemporaries, yet seemed perfectly reasonable to women who had crossed lines they once thought uncrossable, and found the crossing easier than they had ever imagined possible. The disconnect between their refined manner and the horrific nature of their activities had become a source of sophisticated pleasure rather than psychological distress, evidence of their superior ability to manage complex moral and practical challenges that would overwhelm individuals with less flexibility and determination. They had learned to take pride in their ability to maintain perfect social form while engaging in activities that required them to violate fundamental social taboos, viewing this accomplishment as evidence of personal growth and moral sophistication rather than psychological adaptation to criminal behavior. Outside Mrs. Whitmore's windows, London continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the activities transpiring in the refined parlor, where 5 women sat sipping tea and consuming what remained of someone's daughter. The fog had thickened as the afternoon progressed, muffling the sounds of carriage wheels on cobblestones and reducing the city to a series of indistinct shapes that appeared and vanished, like memories half recalled. In the distance, church bells continued their ancient duty of marking time's passage, their bronze voices carrying news of births and deaths, weddings and funerals, the endless cycle of human joy and suffering that provided the backdrop against which all dramas played out. The contrast between the bustling city beyond their windows and the intimate gathering within the parlor had become a source of philosophical reflection for the women who had learned to see themselves as existing simultaneously within and apart from the society that had shaped their identities and provided the context for their activities. They understood themselves to be participants in the great human drama, while also being observers whose special knowledge and experience provided perspectives that were unavailable to those who remained confined within conventional moral and practical limitations. Somewhere in that vast city, families gathered around their own tables to share meals that had been prepared with love and seasoned with prayer. Children laughed at games their parents had played decades earlier, and lovers made promises they believed would last forever. The ordinary world of conventional morality and innocent pleasure continued to exist parallel to their own transformed existence, providing both a source of nostalgia for what they had lost and confirmation of the superior understanding they had gained through their willingness to explore possibilities that others would never consider or accept. The juxtaposition of ordinary human happiness with their own sophisticated appreciation of life's darker complexities had become a recurring theme in their private reflections, reminding them of both the sacrifices they had made and the benefits they had gained through their transformation from conventional women into something unprecedented in their social world. The contrast between that ordinary world and the scene unfolding in Mrs. Whitmore's parlor was so stark as to seem impossible, yet the women around the table had learned that impossibility was merely another word for unexplored possibility, that the boundaries of civilized behavior were far more flexible than society pretended, and that necessity could justify actions that would have been unthinkable under less desperate circumstances. They had discovered that the line between civilization and savagery was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, that the same hands capable of embroidering altar cloths and writing letters of condolence could also prepare human flesh for consumption, and that the same mouths that spoke words of comfort to the grieving and sang hymns of praise on Sunday mornings could also partake of sustenance that would horrify the very people they appeared to comfort and praise. The integration of these contradictory aspects of their identities had required psychological flexibility that they had not known they possessed, along with intellectual sophistication that allowed them to construct frameworks for understanding their behavior that preserved their sense of moral superiority, while accommodating actions that conventional morality would condemn without qualification or exception. As the tea party drew toward its conclusion and the shadows lengthened across the Turkish carpets, each woman began the familiar ritual of departure that marked the end of their clandestine gatherings. The transition from their private world back to the public roles that society expected them to fulfill had become as ritualized as their consumption activities, requiring careful attention to details of appearance and demeanor that would ensure their seamless reintegration into conventional social settings without arousing suspicion about their afternoon's activities. They thanked their hostess with the same gracious phrases that concluded every proper social call, complimented her on the quality of the refreshments with words that carried multiple layers of meaning, and promised to remember her in their prayers with sincerity that was both genuine and deeply ironic. The language of conventional social interaction had been transformed through their shared experiences into a form of secret communication that allowed them to express meanings that would have been impossible to convey through direct statement, creating bonds of intimacy that transcended anything they had experienced in their previous relationships with other women of their social class. Their baskets, now empty of the contributions they had brought to share, were filled instead with portions to take home for family members who had learned not to ask too many questions about their mothers and wives, new interest in exotic preserves and unusual delicacies. The family members who benefited from their treatments had adapted to their improved health and vitality, without questioning the source of these benefits, accepting explanations about dietary improvements and health regimens that avoided specific details about the nature of the supplements that had produced such remarkable results. The children who consumed their mothers' preparations had grown accustomed to the enhanced energy and mental acuity that had become their normal state, while the husbands who shared their wives' meals noticed only that their families seemed healthier and more vigorous than their peers, changes they attributed to better household management and superior attention to nutrition and general health maintenance. The women themselves showed no sign of the afternoon's unusual consumption, their complexions as healthy and their spirits as elevated as if they had spent the time discussing missionary work or planning charitable events rather than partaking of human flesh in the refined setting of a Belgravia parlor. The psychological compartmentalization that allowed them to move seamlessly between their secret activities and their public roles had been perfected through months of practice, enabling them to maintain perfect consistency in their social behavior, regardless of what they had done in private or what they planned to do in future gatherings. As they made their farewells and departed into the thickening fog, each carried with her the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and family protected, along with the secret knowledge that would bind them together more closely than any conventional friendship or social obligation. The bonds that had formed among them through their shared transformation represented a form of intimacy that transcended conventional social relationships, creating connections based on mutual dependence and shared secrets that would endure regardless of changes in their external circumstances or social positions. They had become something unprecedented in their world, yet utterly familiar in the broader scope of human history. Civilized cannibals who had learned to reconcile their appetites with their social position, mothers and wives who had discovered that love could justify actions that would have horrified their former selves, and ladies of refinement who had found that refinement itself could serve as the perfect camouflage for practices that predated civilization itself. The historical perspective that contextualized their activities within the broader patterns of human behavior had become an important element in their self-understanding, allowing them to view their transformation as part of a tradition that extended back to the origins of human society rather than an aberrant deviation from natural law that marked them as criminals or monsters. The knowledge that similar practices had been documented throughout history and across cultures had provided reassurance that their activities represented a return to natural patterns of behavior rather than a descent into madness or evil, enabling them to maintain their sense of moral legitimacy while acknowledging that their methods would not be understood or accepted by those who lacked their superior knowledge and experience. Mrs. Whitmore stood at her window long after the last of her guests had disappeared into the fog, watching the street return to its usual quiet rhythm as evening approached and the lamplighters began their rounds, their flickering torches creating pools of yellow warmth in the gray world outside. In her reflection in the glass, she could see the woman she had become superimposed over the woman she had been, and the transformation seemed both complete and ongoing, as if each gathering moved her further from her original self towards something she was still in the process of becoming. The question of ultimate destination remained open, though she had long since ceased to worry about the final form her transformation might take, having learned to embrace change as a natural and desirable aspect of personal growth, rather than a threat to identity or stability. The woman in the reflection possessed confidence and vitality that her former self had never known, along with knowledge and capabilities that opened possibilities for future development that would have been unimaginable to the conventional matron she had once been. Behind her, the parlor retained its civilized appearance, the evidence of their unusual meal cleared away by servants who had learned to clean without looking too closely at what they were cleaning, and within the hour, the room would be restored to its normal function as the setting for conventional social gatherings, where conventional refreshments would be served to conventional guests who would never suspect what other kinds of entertainment had preceded their arrival. The ability to transform spaces seamlessly between different functions had become another source of pride in their sophisticated management of complex logistics, with careful attention to details that ensured no trace of their activities would remain to arouse suspicion or provide evidence that could compromise their security if their premises were ever searched by hostile parties. The servants who maintained their households had been selected and trained to provide maximum discretion while maintaining the standards of service required by women of their social position, creating environments where unusual activities could be conducted without attracting unwelcome attention from staff members whose loyalty was ensured through generous compensation and clear understanding of the consequences that would follow any breach of confidentiality. The normalcy was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire afternoon. The ease with which horror could be absorbed into routine, and routine could conceal the most shocking deviations from accepted behavior, proof that human nature was far more adaptable than anyone preferred to acknowledge, and that the distance between respectability and monstrosity was measured not in miles or years, but in simple choices that seemed reasonable at the time and led to destinations that would have been unimaginable at the journey's beginning. The philosophical implications of their transformation had become a source of ongoing reflection, with each woman developing her own understanding of what their experiences revealed about the nature of morality, identity, and human potential for adaptation to circumstances that challenged conventional assumptions about proper behavior and acceptable choices. The knowledge that they had successfully navigated moral territory that would have destroyed others had become a source of confidence that prepared them for future challenges that might require similar flexibility and determination to achieve objectives that conventional methods could not accomplish. As the church bells of St. Bartholomew's struck 6 o'clock and called the faithful to evening prayer, Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore smoothed her black silk gloves one final time and prepared to join her family for their regular dinner, where they would discuss the day's events with the same domestic contentment that had marked such conversations for generations, never mentioning the afternoon's activities or the nature of the appetite that had been satisfied in service of love, duty, and the unending human struggle against mortality itself. The integration of their secret lives with their conventional family roles had become so complete that the transition required no conscious effort or psychological preparation, enabling them to move seamlessly between worlds that others would consider mutually exclusive, while maintaining perfect consistency in their relationships with those they loved and protected through their sacrifices and transformations. The evening ahead would unfold according to familiar patterns of domestic routine, with children reciting their lessons and husbands sharing news from their professional activities, while the enhanced vitality that marked every member of these transformed households would be attributed to excellent management and superior attention to health rather than dietary supplements that would horrify anyone who understood their true nature and origin. The weeks that followed their most recent gathering brought developments that would test the security and adaptability of their carefully constructed enterprise, beginning with Dr. Harrow's announcement that his position at St. Bartholomew's was under review by hospital administrators, who had begun to notice irregularities in mortality records that suggested unauthorized research activities were being conducted without proper institutional oversight. The investigation had been triggered by a new chief administrator whose background in military logistics had trained him to notice discrepancies in inventory management that previous administrators had overlooked or ignored, creating a threat to their primary source of materials that required immediate attention and careful management to avoid exposure of their entire network. Dr. Harrow's response to this crisis had been characteristically methodical, involving the systematic destruction of potentially incriminating records while establishing alternative explanations for any activities that could not be completely concealed, along with the activation of contingency plans that had been developed for precisely such eventualities. His years of experience in colonial territories had taught him the importance of maintaining multiple backup systems for essential operations, ensuring that the loss of any single component would not compromise the entire enterprise or expose participants to unnecessary risks. The alternative procurement networks that had been established as insurance against exactly this kind of disruption proved their value when Morrison was forced to suspend his activities at the hospital until the administrative review could be completed and his position secured through whatever combination of bribery, blackmail, and legitimate influence could be brought to bear on the decision-makers involved in the investigation. The funeral homes and private morgues that had joined their network were able to increase their contributions temporarily, though the change in sourcing patterns required adjustments to their preparation schedules and quality control procedures that tested their ability to maintain consistency in their products while adapting to materials that differed in age, health history, and preservation conditions from their usual supplies. The financial costs of this transition were substantial, with premium payments required to ensure reliable service from sources that were being asked to assume greater risks and provide larger quantities than had previously been required. Expenses that had to be absorbed through reallocation of household budgets that were already stretched by the ongoing costs of maintaining their enhanced lifestyle. Miss Pemberton's inheritance from the deceased Countess of Fairfax proved fortuitous in providing resources that could be allocated to address these increased expenses without requiring explanations to husbands who might question unusual expenditures that could not be justified through conventional household management categories. Her newfound financial independence also enabled her to take a more active role in the strategic planning that was required to navigate the current crisis, while positioning their organization for future expansion and development. The investment opportunities that her inheritance made possible included the acquisition of property that could serve as alternative meeting locations and storage facilities, reducing their dependence on Mrs. Whitmore's parlor while providing redundant capabilities that would enhance their operational security and flexibility. The business connections that had been established through her work as a companion also provided access to information about potential recruitment targets and procurement opportunities that had not previously been available to their organization. The recruitment of new members had become both more urgent and more challenging, as their existing supply networks came under pressure, and their resource requirements increased beyond what their current membership could sustain. Lady Thornfield's connections among the aristocratic families whose children attended the same schools and social events as her own family had identified several potential candidates whose circumstances suggested they might be receptive to unconventional approaches to medical treatment, though the vetting process required to evaluate their suitability was necessarily lengthy and complex. The women who were being considered for membership represented a higher social stratum than their current group, with connections to political and military leaders whose protection could prove valuable, but whose exposure could also create catastrophic security risks if their recruitment was not managed with absolute precision and care. The balance between potential benefits and risks required careful analysis that took into account not only the personal characteristics of individual candidates, but also the broader implications of expanding their membership to include women whose social positions could provide either unprecedented opportunities or devastating vulnerabilities. Mrs. Blackwood's intelligence regarding government attitudes toward their activities had become increasingly sophisticated, as her husband's position provided access to classified information about law enforcement priorities and investigative techniques that could threaten their operations. The establishment of new police units specifically dedicated to investigating unusual crimes and the adoption of more scientific approaches to criminal detection had created challenges that required adaptation of their security procedures and operational methods to avoid detection by authorities whose capabilities were evolving more rapidly than their countermeasures. The development of photographic evidence techniques and the increasing use of medical experts in criminal investigations represented particular threats to organizations whose activities left physical evidence that could be analyzed by specialists trained to identify patterns that would be invisible to conventional investigators. The intelligence that Mrs. Blackwood provided about these developments enabled their group to stay ahead of law enforcement capabilities, though the margin of safety was narrowing in ways that required constant vigilance and regular updates to their security protocols. The psychological toll of maintaining their double lives had become more apparent as the months passed and the complexity of their activities increased, with each woman developing coping mechanisms that allowed her to function effectively in both her secret and public roles, while managing the stress that resulted from constantly monitoring her behavior to avoid actions or statements that might compromise their security. Mrs. Ashworth's religious framework had proven particularly resilient, enabling her to maintain her faith while accommodating activities that challenged conventional theological understanding through sophisticated interpretations that emphasized the primacy of loving care over abstract moral principles. Her ability to participate fully in church activities while privately engaging in practices that most Christians would consider abhorrent had required theological flexibility that impressed even Dr. Harrow, whose own religious background had been shaped by exposure to belief systems that were more tolerant of moral ambiguity than the rigid structures that characterized mainstream Christianity. The sermons that Mrs. Ashworth heard each Sunday had taken on new meanings as she learned to interpret biblical passages through the lens of her transformed understanding of divine will and human responsibility, finding support for their activities in scriptures that others would cite as condemnation of such practices. The effects on their children had continued to be overwhelmingly positive, with educational achievements and physical development that exceeded even the optimistic expectations that had motivated their parents. Initial experiments with unconventional dietary supplements. The academic performance of these children had attracted attention from educators who recognized exceptional talent that seemed to improve with each passing month, leading to opportunities for advanced instruction and prestigious educational placements that would have been unlikely without the enhanced cognitive abilities that resulted from their supplemented nutrition. The social development of the children had been equally impressive, with leadership qualities and emotional maturity that distinguished them from their peers, while avoiding the kind of obvious superiority that might have aroused suspicion about the source of their advantages. The athletic achievements of several of the children had led to recognition at regional and national levels, with physical capabilities that reflected not only excellent general health, but also strength and endurance that exceeded normal human parameters in ways that suggested their dietary supplements were providing benefits that extended far beyond simple nutrition. The long-term implications of their children's enhanced development had become a source of both pride and concern, as it became clear that the benefits they were providing might create expectations and capabilities that could only be maintained through continued access to their unusual dietary supplements. The question of whether their children would be able to function normally without continued treatment had been raised but never fully explored, partly because none of the mothers wanted to consider the possibility that their efforts to protect and enhance their children might have created dependencies that could prove problematic in future situations where their specialized nutrition might not be available. The ethical questions surrounding their decision to provide treatments to children who could not give informed consent had been resolved through appeals to parental authority and the obvious benefits that the treatments provided, though private moments of doubt sometimes surfaced when they contemplated the full implications of what they had chosen to do for and to their families. Dr. Harrow's research into the theoretical foundations of their practices had continued to evolve, with new discoveries about optimal preparation techniques and dosage schedules that improved both the effectiveness and safety of their treatments, while reducing the quantities of raw materials required for each dose. His development of concentration techniques that extracted and purified the active principles from heart tissue had enabled them to maintain their enhanced health with smaller quantities of source material, reducing both their procurement costs and their exposure to detection through unusual consumption patterns. The chemical analysis that supported these improvements had required access to laboratory equipment and scientific literature that was not readily available through conventional channels, leading to the establishment of relationships with researchers whose own work operated at the margins of acceptable scientific practice, and who were willing to provide assistance in exchange for access to data about the effects of their treatments on human subjects. The documentation that Dr. Harrow maintained regarding their activities had grown into a comprehensive archive that recorded not only the practical details of their operations, but also the physiological and psychological effects of their treatments on both adult and juvenile subjects. The scientific value of this data was considerable, representing the most complete record of controlled human experimentation with sympathetic medicine that had ever been compiled, though its preservation created security risks that had to be balanced against its potential value for future research and development. The coding systems that protected this information from casual discovery had been supplemented with physical security measures that ensured the archive could be quickly destroyed if their activities were ever discovered by hostile parties, while backup copies were maintained in secure locations that would preserve the scientific legacy of their work even if the original records were compromised. The expansion of their activities beyond simple consumption to include more sophisticated applications of sympathetic medicine had opened possibilities that extended far beyond the health maintenance that had originally motivated their transformation. Dr. Harrow's experiments with targeted organ therapy had demonstrated that specific physiological and psychological enhancements could be achieved through consumption of corresponding tissues from carefully selected donors, leading to treatments that could improve memory, enhance physical strength, or augment sensory capabilities in ways that provided advantages far beyond what conventional medicine could offer. The selection criteria for donors who could provide these specialized benefits had become increasingly sophisticated, taking into account not only physical health but also intellectual achievements, athletic abilities, and personality characteristics that might be transferable through proper preparation and consumption of appropriate tissues. The moral implications of these advanced applications had required additional rationalization, as the women found themselves moving beyond the relatively simple justification of protecting family health to actively seeking enhancement capabilities that could provide competitive advantages in social, academic, and professional contexts. The utilitarian calculus that had originally supported their activities as necessary medical intervention had expanded to encompass broader concepts of human potential and the responsibility of those with superior knowledge to maximize their capabilities for the benefit of society as a whole. The notion that their enhanced abilities created obligations to use those abilities for worthy purposes had become an important element in their self-justification, enabling them to view their continuing consumption as a form of stewardship that maximized the value obtained from materials that would otherwise be wasted, while creating benefits that extended beyond their immediate families to influence their broader social circles and community activities. The seasonal variations in mortality rates that had initially created supply challenges had been addressed through the development of more sophisticated preservation techniques that extended the useful life of their materials, while maintaining potency levels that ensured consistent effectiveness regardless of storage duration. The chemical processes that enabled long-term preservation had been adapted from methods used in colonial territories, where tropical conditions required special techniques for maintaining the viability of medical supplies over extended periods without refrigeration or other modern preservation methods. The investment in equipment and materials required for these advanced preservation techniques had been substantial, requiring modifications to Mrs. Whitmore's kitchen facilities that had to be explained as upgrades designed to support her increased interest in gourmet cooking and food preservation, explanations that were accepted without question by household staff, who had become accustomed to their employers' evolving interests and hobbies. The social networks that connected their families to the broader London elite had become increasingly valuable as sources of intelligence about potential donors and recruitment targets. With careful attention paid to gathering information about the health, circumstances, and family situations of individuals who might either provide materials for their consumption or candidates for membership in their organization. The charity work that had originally served as cover for their procurement activities had evolved into a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation that provided detailed information about the medical conditions, financial circumstances, and social vulnerabilities of hundreds of families across London's various social strata. The information collected through these activities was carefully catalogued and analyzed to identify opportunities that could advance their objectives while minimizing risks to their security and operational effectiveness. The relationship between their enhanced capabilities and their social responsibilities had become a subject of ongoing discussion, with each woman developing her own understanding of how their transformation created obligations to use their advantages for purposes that extended beyond personal and family benefit. Mrs. Whitmore's charitable activities had expanded to include more direct intervention in cases where conventional assistance was inadequate to address the problems faced by those she sought to help, with her enhanced energy and insight enabling her to identify solutions that would not have been apparent to someone operating within normal human limitations. Lady Thornfield's connections within aristocratic circles had enabled her to influence political discussions and social policies in ways that reflected her superior understanding of human nature and social dynamics, though she was careful to ensure that her influence was exercised subtly enough to avoid attracting attention to the source of her enhanced capabilities. The question of succession and the long-term perpetuation of their organization had begun to receive serious consideration as it became apparent that their activities had created value and capabilities that should not be allowed to disappear with their current generation. The training of their children in the theoretical foundations and practical techniques of their methods had been discussed but not implemented, partly due to concerns about the ethical implications of involving minors in activities that they could not fully understand or consent to participate in. The alternative of recruiting younger women who could eventually assume leadership roles within their organization had been explored through careful evaluation of candidates whose age and circumstances would enable them to benefit from extended training and gradual introduction to the full scope of their activities. The technological developments that were beginning to transform London's medical and scientific communities represented both opportunities and threats to their continued operations, with new diagnostic techniques and investigative methods that could either expose their activities or provide new resources for enhancing their effectiveness. The photography and microscopy techniques that were being adopted by progressive medical practitioners could potentially provide evidence of their activities that would be difficult to explain through conventional means, requiring adaptation of their security protocols to address threats that had not existed when their organization was first established. At the same time, these new technologies offered possibilities for improving their own methods through more precise analysis of their materials and more accurate measurement of the effects produced by their treatments. The international connections that some of their members maintained through family and business relationships had provided intelligence about similar practices in other countries, with reports of organizations that had developed along parallel lines in response to similar needs and opportunities. The possibility of establishing communication or cooperation with these foreign groups had been discussed as a potential source of knowledge and resources that could enhance their own capabilities while providing security through diversification of their activities across multiple jurisdictions. The risks associated with such international expansion had to be weighed against the potential benefits, particularly given the communication and transportation limitations that would make coordination with foreign operations significantly more complex than their current London-based activities. As autumn deepened into winter, and the fog-shrouded city settled into the rhythms that would carry it through the darker months ahead, Mrs. Whitmore found herself increasingly reflective about the transformation that had brought her from conventional widowhood to leadership of an organization whose activities would have been unimaginable to her former self. The journey had been marked by choices that had seemed inevitable at the time, but now revealed themselves as part of a pattern that had led inexorably to destinations that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The woman she had become possessed capabilities and knowledge that would have terrified the woman she had been, yet the transition had been so gradual and seemingly logical that she could barely remember what it had felt like to inhabit her former limitations and moral constraints. The success of their enterprise had exceeded every expectation, providing benefits that extended far beyond the health improvements that had originally motivated their experimentation with Dr. Harrow's theories. Their families had been transformed into something approaching a new form of human development, with capabilities that suggested possibilities for future evolution that could reshape the fundamental nature of human society. The knowledge they had gained about the relationship between consumption and enhancement had implications that extended far beyond medical treatment to encompass questions about human potential, social organization, and the responsibilities that accompanied superior capabilities. The power they now possessed carried obligations that they were only beginning to understand, along with opportunities that would require careful consideration of their long-term objectives and the legacy they wanted to create through their unprecedented achievements. The winter evening gathered around Mrs. Whitmore's house like a familiar companion, its darkness no longer threatening, but rather comforting in its concealment of activities that the daylight world was not yet ready to understand or accept. Tomorrow would bring another gathering, another opportunity to nourish themselves and their families through methods that challenged every assumption about proper behavior, while providing benefits that justified whatever moral accommodations were required to maintain their transformed existence. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted territory whose exploration would require all the courage, intelligence, and determination that their enhanced capabilities could provide, a future that belonged to those who had learned that civilization was not a destination, but merely a starting point for those bold enough to continue the journey toward possibilities that conventional wisdom could never imagine or achieve.